The Prague Spring was a period of political liberalization and reform in Czechoslovakia that unfolded in 1968. Led by Alexander Dubček, the first secretary of the Communist Party, the movement sought to create socialism with a human face by introducing democratic reforms and greater political openness. Dubček's vision included press freedom, freedom of speech, and increased autonomy for Czechoslovakia within the communist framework. This period of political thawing faced intense opposition from the Soviet Union and other Warsaw Pact nations. In a dramatic turn of events, on the night of the 20th to 21st of August 1968, Warsaw Pact troops, predominantly led by the Soviet Union, invaded Czechoslovakia to suppress the liberalization efforts. The invasion aimed to quash any deviation from the established socialist model and to reinforce Soviet dominance in the Eastern Bloc. The Prague Spring suppression had a lasting impact, highlighting the limitations of pursuing reforms within the communist system and reaffirming the Soviet Union's determination to maintain control over its satellite states. Despite the brevity of the Prague Spring, its legacy symbolizes the struggle for political autonomy within the confines of the Cold War's Eastern Bloc. Unrest in the Eastern Bloc. The Cold War, a geopolitical and ideological struggle between the United States and the Soviet Union, shaped the global landscape for much of the mid-20th century. As the Iron Curtain descended across Europe, dividing the continent into the democratic West and the communist East, the Eastern Bloc emerged as a stronghold of Soviet influence. The Eastern Bloc, a group of socialist states under Soviet influence, stood in opposition to the democratic nations of the West. This tension was a key factor for events to come. Furthermore, within this context, the Hungarian uprising of 1956 played a pivotal role, also setting the stage for later events. In October of 1956, Hungary erupted in a popular uprising against Soviet-backed communist rule. Fueled by a desire for political freedom, economic reforms, and independence from Soviet dominance, the Hungarian people took to the streets. The Soviet response was swift and brutal. In November 1956, Soviet forces invaded Hungary, crushing the rebellion and reinstalling a pro-Soviet government. The Hungarian uprising had a profound impact on the dynamics of the Eastern Bloc. It exposed the limitations of Soviet leader Nikita Khrushchev's policy of de-Stalinization, as Moscow was unwilling to tolerate challenges to its control over satellite states. The violent suppression of the Hungarian uprising sent a clear message to other Eastern Bloc nations. Dissent would not be tolerated, and Moscow would use force to maintain its influence. The events of 1956 in Hungary reverberated across the Eastern Bloc, contributing to a climate of tension and discontent. As the 1960s progressed, calls for reform and greater political autonomy gained momentum. Czechoslovakia, under the leadership of Alexander Dubček, sought to chart a more independent course within the communist framework. In January 1968, Dubček was elected first secretary of the Communist Party of Czechoslovakia, sowing the seeds of the Prague Spring. His vision of socialism with a human face aimed at creating a more open and democratic socialist system. However, the Prague Spring faced strong opposition from the Soviet leadership. Tensions boil over. The Prague Spring of 1968 marked a crucial episode in the history of Czechoslovakia, symbolizing the aspirations for political liberalization and autonomy within the Eastern Bloc. Led by Alexander Dubček, the first secretary of the Communist Party, the movement sought to implement reforms that would redefine socialism and create a more open and democratic society. The origins of the Prague Spring can be traced to the 5th of January 1968, when Dubček was elected to replace Antonín Novotný as the first secretary. Dubček's rise signalled a departure from the hardline Stalinist policies that characterized Novotny's leadership. Dubček's vision, encapsulated in the action program, aimed at introducing socialism with a human face. The proposed reforms included greater political freedom, freedom of the press, and economic restructuring. One of the crucial aspects of the Prague Spring was the relaxation of censorship and the blossoming of a more open political climate. Newspapers and media outlets began expressing diverse opinions, and citizens engaged in discussions about the future direction of their country. This newfound freedom of expression gave birth to a sense of optimism and civic engagement. The political reforms outlined by Dubček faced resistance, both domestically and internationally, while the Czechoslovak citizens embraced the changes. The conservative elements within the Communist Party and the leadership of the Soviet Union viewed these reforms with suspicion. The Soviet leadership, then under Leonid Brezhnev, was particularly concerned about the potential erosion of communist ideology and the loss of control over a satellite state. Despite the tensions, the Prague Spring initially unfolded without direct intervention from the Soviet Union. Dubček's government was given a degree of autonomy, but the situation changed dramatically on the night of August 20th, 21st, 1968. In a swift and brutal move, Warsaw Pact troops, led predominantly by the Soviet Union, invaded Czechoslovakia to crush the reform movement. The invasion involved hundreds of thousands of troops from the Soviet Union, East Germany, Poland, Bulgaria, and Hungary. That night, 165,000 troops and 4,600 tanks entered the country. They first occupied the Ruzhny International Airport, where air deployment of more troops was arranged. The Czechoslovak forces were confined to their barracks, which was surrounded until the threat of a counterattack was assuaged. By the morning of the 21st of August, Czechoslovakia was occupied. During the invasion, 72 Czechs and Slovaks were killed, 266 severely wounded, and another 436 slightly injured. Alexander Dubček called upon his people not to resist. Nevertheless, there was scattered resistance in the streets. Road signs in towns were removed or painted over, except for those indicating the way to Moscow. Many small villages renamed themselves Dubček or Svoboda. Thus, without navigational equipment, the invaders were often confused. The invading forces encountered resistance from Czechoslovak citizens, who staged protests and demonstrations. However, the sheer force of the Warsaw Pact military overwhelmed the opposition. Dubček and other key reformist leaders were arrested, and the country fell under strict Soviet control. The dream of reformed socialism in Czechoslovakia was shattered. Soviet and international reaction. In April of 1969, Dubček was replaced as the first secretary by Gustav Husak, and a period of normalization began. Dubček was expelled from the Czechoslovak Communist Party and given a job as a forestry official. The international community responded with condemnation. Western nations expressed their disapproval of the invasion, but practical support for the Czechoslovak people was limited. The invasion strained relations between the Eastern and Western blocs, contributing to the already tense atmosphere of the Cold War. The aftermath of the Prague Spring was characterized by a period of normalization, where the Soviet-backed regime suppressed dissent, purged the Communist Party of reformist elements, and reinstated a more conservative political agenda. The Prague Spring left an indelible mark on the collective memory of Czechoslovakia. The movement's ideals of political freedom and autonomy persisted, fueling later attempts at political change, including the Velvet Revolution of 1989. Despite its suppression, the Prague Spring remains a symbol of the desire for political self-determination within the Eastern Bloc. Internationally, the invasion of Czechoslovakia during the Prague Spring drew condemnation from various quarters. Western countries, including the United States and its NATO allies, strongly criticized the Soviet Union and its allies for violating the sovereignty of a fellow communist state. The invasion exacerbated tensions between the superpowers and strained the prospects for détente. Within the communist world, reactions were mixed. While some socialist countries, like East Germany and Poland, actively participated in the military intervention, others, such as Romania and Yugoslavia, condemned the invasion. The actions of the Soviet Union and its allies exposed deep divisions within the communist bloc regarding the acceptable limits of state sovereignty and the degree of autonomy member states could enjoy. The suppression of the Prague Spring had a lasting impact on the dynamics of the Cold War. It served as a stark reminder of the Soviet Union's determination to maintain control over its sphere of influence, even at the cost of employing military force against a fellow socialist state. The invasion highlighted the limits of autonomy within the Eastern Bloc and contributed to the ideological fractures that persisted until the end of the Cold War. The international community's condemnation underscored the complexities and contradictions inherent in the relationships between socialist states during the tumultuous period. Thank you for watching this video. If you enjoyed it, then please give it a like, and for more amazing tales and thrilling stories, don't forget to subscribe to Uncovered Secrets. Also, hit the bell icon to stay notified for every release.